If you've watched episode 1 and 2, thank you. And episode 3, we're going to be covering the visible villain, tourism. Anyway, let me introduce myself. I'm Sean Woolley, Managing Director of Cloud9 Spain. With me, I have my co-author, published author, don't you know, Alfredo Bloy-Dawson. And we've written a book, don't you know, it's called Home Truths, a candid analysis of the Costa del Sol property market, the 2026 edition, because it's 2026. So first couple of episodes, we set the scene and we talked in the last episode about COVID and the impact, which is kind of where the book starts, really. I want to talk to you about probably the most controversial bit in the book, which is the one that the journalists have picked up on, which is the tourism issue. Now, my understanding is that there's a kind of backlash against over-tourism in many, many places, including most of the Mediterranean basin, I think. And we know that there's been significant protests, places like Barcelona, places like the Canary Islands, the Balearic Islands. Hasn't touched so much the Costa del Sol, has it? I mean,
there have been a couple in Málaga city, but they're like organized protests.
Okay. Oh, and what are they against?
Affordable housing. That's the that's the thing. You know, these foreigners keep on buying stuff. Prices go up. We can't afford to live in this city in our own towns.
So yeah, because
that's the nub of it.
One of the things we pointed out in the book was: is tourism the root cause, or is it just the visible symptom of underlying issues like the provision of affordable housing that they're just not being provided? You know, should we blame tourists?
No, it's ridiculous. It's just stupid. It's 5-year-old economics. My daughters, they might come up with a more wise conclusion.
But the problem is it's emotionally charged, isn't it? Because it affects locals and people like, I think most people like fair play, don't they? And the problem is that you've got, we talk, you know, we've all got Spanish friends and we mix with Spanish people who can no longer afford to live in the towns where they were brought up in, or certainly their kids can't.
I couldn't buy where I live now. I couldn't afford where I live now.
Right. A million of these sold, you'll be fine.
So please, don't do it for me. Do it for the kids. So we can buy a nicer house. 22 euros or so. But look, this is we're not professing to be Spanish political or economic experts. So it's its own thing, right? Yeah. But from the ground, from people that live here, in my case, I was raised here, I work here, my kids go to school here, I pay taxes here. The problem is there's not enough houses. There's more demand than there is supply. That pushes price.
Generally, or just for locals?
Generally, the anti-tourism sentiment makes much more sense if you think of it from a city point of view.
It does, which is why Barcelona.
We feel it's a bit weird here. Right now we're in Montemayor, and I see like, you know, what's going to happen if we don't let the foreigners buy that house over there that's 4 million. Does that mean that Paco that works at the bakery can now buy it? You know, so it's a different. The money's coming from a different place for a different purpose. Is what I'm trying to say. Yeah. So there's a much more logic in all of this if you think of it as a city thing, where people that have been raised, they cannot leave their Spanish people are one of the family. They're one of the oldest in Europe of leaving home and becoming independent. That was always an issue, right? The root issue, in my opinion, just to put it to you simply, is that there's not enough properties to satisfy demand. Everywhere, and Spanish wages have not increased in line with everything else. Spanish people are not paid enough.
But is that here? Because if you go inland into the real Spain, because this is a bubble, isn't it? The Costa del Sol is a bubble. I kind of like it because I think the world's a bit of a crazy place at the moment. So stick me in a bubble, I'm very happy. But if you're a farmer up in, I don't know, Ubeda or something like that, then your wages, I'm guessing, will probably have been in line with.
Maybe. I mean, I think the Fred.
If you're a Spaniard in Fuengirola, for instance, then it's going to be.
Málaga City is a really good example of it. You know, the neighborhoods that are Spanish neighborhoods, that if you owned a couple of apartments, you're laughing if you want to sell it now. But if you're 25 years old and you've finished your university degree and you want to buy your first house, you got to have 500K and you're earning 1,800 a month.
But is that the fault of tourism, or is that the fault of governments not providing
government? It's
housing.
It's central government.
But tourism is the easy target, isn't it? Because it's visible. What you can't see policy. you can see tourists, and you think, if those buggers weren't here,
No, yeah, I think we've got to separate things. I think
we have.
I think
But
honestly,
I don't think journalists
Yeah.
want to, because
You
it's
don't-
a great headline.
the wages in Spain are not high enough considering where everything's gone prices wise. For the Spanish people.
But particularly here on the Costa del Sol, where things tend to be more expensive.
Sure, but I just mean that is a real issue, and that the property thing is like the cherry on top. I can't even afford to buy my first house until I'm 40 now. What I'm trying to say is it is a problem. The root of it is a problem. It does need sorting. But blaming on the tourists is like blaming on the boogie.
In that case, because obviously there's been a backlash against holiday rentals, hasn't there? There has in Barcelona. I think they've stripped every license. They're talking about doing it. Well, they have done it in Malaga. I think they've frozen new licenses for 3 years. They're probably going to do it in other municipalities as well. I think the benefit we have on the Costa del Sol is that we're fairly stretched out as a location, so we don't feel the effect. We don't see it on a day-to-day basis. But in cities, there is a backlash, isn't there? And I do think that tourists have become an easy target. And I think, again, one of the policies about restricting holiday rentals, is it a bit of a knee jerk? Is it just too late? It's kind of like, is that the answer? Surely the answer is to build more houses, build more apartments, make some of them, because they do in the UK, a proportion of a new development has to be for affordable housing. And there doesn't seem to be that policy here.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're trying to. I think the Bank of Spain said that in 2025, as of 2025, there was a deficit of 700,000 houses in Spain.
Wow.
And there's nothing happening to change that, really. So the problem's going to get worse, but that is, and I think for the purposes of the podcast, it's not really you have the Airbnb element and the tourists, but we're not really talking about the tourists. We're really talking about foreign buyers, foreigners,
which is a different
buying second homes here that they don't live in.
Yeah. So it's empty housing.
So it's not the Airbnb element is almost like the byproduct of it.
Yeah.
Like my house is empty 10 months a year.
Yeah.
I can't afford. I'm a Spanish person. I can't afford to rent because you're Airbnb and everything that moves, and so there's nothing available for rent. Because there's nothing available for rent, then the price of rent is huge, and the trend has been. This is the irony of it. Again, I don't want to go into politics because I don't know enough about it, but just from the helicopter view, if you have a situation where you're trying to encourage long-term rentals, the first step is to make it a little bit less easy for people to not pay their rent. Like, who wants to do long-term rentals? Like, it's just terrifying. This, the some of the stuff that happens here, that the protections for people, for squatters, rights and stuff like that, means who is a massive risk for homeowners. So, and the second thing that's just mental, again, for our market, I do understand it's in the cities, but for our coastal market, if you have a second home here in Spain, in Marbella, and you live in Stockholm, and maybe you use it 2 or 3 months a year on and off, maybe, and when you're not using it, you have an Airbnb, so you make a little bit of income, allows you to, you're paying taxes and all this stuff, let's not forget, but you got 10 months where you're not using it. So maybe you buy a better house or more expensive house. Maybe you buy it in the first place because you can offset some of that cost with a short-term rental, an Airbnb thing. And the government goes, no, we're not having that. We're pausing. We're not going to let you do that. You just don't buy the house. Because that's not gonna make you go long-term rental, because then you can't use your own house. It's ridiculous. It's just, again, you have to think about it. I don't mean to be so dismissive to a massive Spanish problem that's real, but it feels ridiculous to us here in Marbella or Montemayor or stuff like that. And we just have to understand that this is something that is a bigger problem than the Costa del Sol is. It's more a problem of Madrid, of Barcelona, of Valencia, of Malaga, where there are millions of people that literally can't afford to ever leave leave home, and you can't sell and go up the ladder or any of that stuff like that. So it's a real problem.
I think the big problem here is just finding the balance, isn't it? I mean, the thing that goes unsaid, of course, is if we didn't have tourists on the Costa del Sol, if we didn't have the amount of people coming here, investing in the economy, buying houses, spending money like it's going out of fashion in bars and restaurants, the locals would have no income. So it's balancing that up, isn't it? It's almost a question of, we understand, we hear what you're saying, but be careful what you wish for.
Yeah, the protests are not against tourists. They're against not being able to have affordable housing.
Yeah.
The Airbnb element isn't so that you don't have visitors coming into Malaga airport and coming to visit. It's the property element of it. The government, the pressure. You ask the Spanish person that's in this march,
Yeah.
they're going, tourists go to the hotels, leave us the houses. So that it's more the homeowners that doing the Airbnbs of houses that should be available for rent is the issue. It's not the tourist that does the renting that is the issue, as far as they're concerned.
It's interesting because you talk about it being not a tourist issue or anti-tourist issue, but a lack of affordable housing for locals. And I get that. But the problem is, of course, that doesn't make a juicy story, isn't it? And most of the journalists that I've spoken to, they want to incorporate the tourist angle because that sells newspapers and it's clickbait, isn't it? So they want to know, okay, where's the friction? Is it those foreign tourists? Is it the Brits who are dominating and coming into Malaga with their hens and stags and meaning people can't afford
Maybe
to live?
those. I think that's a point to say. Marbella was like, this is the most international place on the planet. The mayor will say quite clearly, we love tourists, but there's the quality of tourism that we have an issue with.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I think everybody agrees on that, and you'd agree with that, right?
Absolutely.
We don't want the hens and the stags and the Club 1830s and Benidorm and Magaluf. That's not what anybody wants. Malaga City is a beautiful city. The people from Malaga don't mind tourists. What they don't want is a bunch of screaming lads with their t-shirts off in the middle of the town center, which is a traditional Spanish city where people dress up and they put their nice clothes on to go around for a little walk around the city. That they don't want, and I don't think anybody wants that.
No, I noticed that in Malaga the last couple of times I've been, just how it had attracted that sort of tourist, and I was disappointed because it has always been a very elegant, beautiful city, very Spanish, but with a cosmopolitan mix, which was really healthy. And now it's just become a little bit the other way.
And that changes the places that you can eat. It changes the places they get serviced. So then the shops become tat, the bar, you have more McDonald's, more of those sort of things, less. Yeah. So all the things that make a city like Malaga amazing become less attractive financially than
But also, and this is going maybe off tangent a little bit, but having money doesn't mean you have manners, because we've had a couple of holiday rentals here in Montemayor in the last 12 months that have behaved disgracefully. And, we've had to call the police, and they're renting places out for 20,000 a week. And it's like, so how do we fix this?
So we're not talking about money. We're not talking about money. We're just talking about a type of tourists.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people, the Spanish people from Malaga, that hate what's happening to Malaga, and we'll have dinner time arguments.
Oh wow, okay.
I'll go, but it's amazing now, and they're like, they hate it, and they don't need the money. They got good jobs and stuff like that. They do it. It's more of a social thing for them, because a lot of these people that I'm talking about are in some degree or other civil servants, related, so they don't benefit from the tourist dollar.
Okay, yeah.
So for them, I'd rather not have it. Thank you very much. I want to be able to walk down Calle Larios with my wife and my kid and not be crushed by the crowds of tourists off a cruise ship. There's no upside for them. The prices are going up in all the restaurants.
So the restaurant owners are like, come on in.
Exactly.
Come on in.
Oh yeah, English breakfast here. And suddenly they're like, wait, what happened to the, So those people, I'm just offering it as a contrast, do not agree with any of what we're saying in terms of revenue and investment and redevelopment and all that for everybody else.
We talked about Malaga, obviously, because it's the
nearest big city.
The biggest city, yeah. But I guess this phenomenon affects towns like Marbella, Estepona,
for sure,
Torremolinos, Fuengirola, where prices, they've all gone up.
But the income hasn't gone up. This is going back, but I'm not where I live.
But the income will have gone up if you own a restaurant or run a bar or
yeah.
But so does it become a personal thing? We're all selfish. We all look out for number one.
Yeah.
If I'm employed by central government and I've got a job for life, it doesn't matter whether there's tourists out there or not. In fact, I prefer there not to be. But if I run a restaurant and my profits are going to double,
no, because the people don't have more money. What's happening in reality on the ground that I'm seeing is a mother and 2 kids, single mom and 2 kids, that should have a 3-bedroom apartment that 10, 5, 6, 7 years ago could afford to rent one for 500 euros, now is in a bedsit.
Yeah.
So she's still earning the same crap wage she was earning before. The only difference is that she's sleeping on the sofa.
So is it that
So she's not earning more money. The house isn't any better. The prices have gone up.
So should we have a fairer, better redistribution of tourist wealth? Would that be, because I think that's what people want, isn't it? They want access to affordable housing, but they also want, they don't mind the tourist dollar or the tourist euro or the tourist pound, but they want to see some of it. They want some of it to be recirculated back into the local area. And I agree with that. I think that's absolutely fine. It's going almost to the wrong people who just want to increase profits. And
you got 3 markets in Spain, which is the coastal tourist resort areas, is where we're at. You have the cities, and then you have the urban land, the countryside. And the 3 different markets, they operate in 3 different ways. And the bulk of this issue is around the cities. So you just have to, my advice would be, read between the lines, get informed. If you're worried about it, don't believe everything you see. There's a lot of well-intentioned people.
got a better idea than that. If you're worried, just read the book.
Read the book. Get the book.
Home Truths, a candid analysis of the Costa del Sol property market.
Available on Amazon.
For about 500 euros. No, but we cover that. We cover it in depth. We kind of balance the arguments and try and find solutions. But it is a key one. And I think it's something that anyone thinking of buying or investing or working in the market here, they should read that, because they get asked by the clients. We do. And it's good to have at least an opinion, even if it's not the opinion that a buyer wants to hear. You've got to kind of form your own ideas. And this is where this may help.
I think as a final point with the tourism, anti-tourism sentiment, all that stuff, the one thing that I think is a safe thing to say is,
when you're going on your march,
is don't take headlines at their face value.
Exactly.
Just really,
exactly.
The more often than not, it's missing the point of what's going on.
Oh, it's a weird and wonderful world we live in, isn't it, Alfredo?
Yeah.
So
I could say that, like we've said this in other videos, but as I'm a foreigner, you're a foreigner, we live here, I don't see and witness any issue whatsoever. It really, I don't know what people that read the headlines might imagine it is like, but it's not a noticeable. I don't notice it.
Yeah, true.
Okay,
that's episode 3 done. We'll move on to episode 4 next time. Until then, keep well, keep safe.
Buy the book.
And buy the book. Buy 3. Watch episode 1. Take care.